joined today by John Borthwick, who is the CEO of Betaworks. So, John, please come on and take a seat maybe next to me here on this couch. Hillary Mason, who's founder at Fast Forward Labs. Kathy McEwan, who's director of the Data Science Institute at Columbia University. The Institute for Data Sciences and Engineering, I think, is its full title. And Amanda Stent, who is a researcher here at Bloomberg, where she's working on natural language processing as well as other technologies. So thank you all for joining us this morning. So we're going to get started quickly. I was actually struck by several things John said, so maybe we'll use a couple of his comments as a way to guide our discussion. But first, maybe I'll just ask you to sort of introduce yourselves and say a little bit about what you're doing with regard to machines and media. And I'll start with John.
So I'm CEO of Betaworks. And at Betaworks, we both build companies and also invest around specific themes, all at the intersection of media and technology. And over the last, 5-7 years, we've done a whole bunch of company development, either building or investing, as it relates to big data, machine learning, and sort of how media gets transformed at the intersection of those things.
Hillary.
Good morning. I'm Hillary Mason. I'm the founder of Fast Forward Labs. So to give you a bit of context on that, we help people build the machines. We are an applied AI research group. We do our own applied machine learning research, so we are trying to stay on top of what is possible. And then on the other side of our work, we work with organizations, small and large, to think about how to use these technologies to progress their product and business visions. And that tends to involve a lot of algorithmic work, which is a lot of fun, but it also involves thinking about things like process, because the way you build machine learning applications is different than the way you build software applications, and people and sort of organizational structures that support building these sorts of products.
Kathy.
My name is Kathy McEwan, and I'm a professor in the computer science department at Columbia University, and I also am the director of the Columbia Data Science Institute. In my research, which is what I'll talk about today, I do natural language processing, and I'm very interested in text summarization, so how we take streams of news or social media, online discussion forums, email, and generate summaries. I'm also very interested in analysis of social media of different kinds, and I guess also relevant here, I'm interested in question answering and generation of updates.
Amanda.
My name's Amanda Stent. I work in the CTO office at Bloomberg. Part of what I do is to work to make the content inherent in text into structured data that can be used to generate news, and also a little bit going the other way, taking data and automatically generating stories or information in text form.
So one of the reasons we put this panel together the way we did is to try to get at the full spectrum of commercialization, from what's happening in the university to what's happening in a group like Hillary's, which is sort of in an in-between, I think, between the way that universities develop technology and the way that companies do. Amanda, who's commercializing technology here at Bloomberg, and John, who's doing it in the context of startups. But I think I want to start maybe with Kathy and just ask you, what are you working on? What are you cooking at Columbia right now that you're excited about that's going to change the state of the art with regard to the intersection of data and media?
So I'll mention three things. The first, which I'm very excited about, we're working jointly with a group of researchers from social work on analyzing the social media posted by gang-involved youth in Chicago. And they tend to post about trauma. They experience a lot of trauma. Friends and family have been shot and killed. And then that often turns to retribution, and they may post about, they may make aggressive posts. And so in our work, we're developing technology to automatically detect when a post is either about grief or trauma, or aggression. And our goal is to, when we detect aggressive posts, to be able to interact with community outreach groups to intervene and diffuse violence. So that's one that I'm very excited about. We're also working on tracking events over time, and in particular, we're looking at tracking disaster, being able to provide hourly updates on what's new, and looking at it also from a personal point of view, providing summaries of the experiences of individuals who have lived through the event.
So maybe John will come slightly over to the entrepreneur. What's Betaworks cooking right now that you're excited about at the intersection of machines and media?
You know, I think that before I answer that, let me just sort of lift up a second. So, you know, John's introductory remarks made me think that, you know, I remember about 20 years ago, actually 20 years ago next month, I was in Midtown and watching Gary Kasparov be defeated by Big Blue, right? And that was sort of for me, that was sort of a demarcation point in the sort of transition of big data and machine learning. And what's happened in that 20 years is that we've been, I think we're now starting to move up the steeper part of the J-curve. And over the last 10, 15 years, there's been just an incredible amount of work that has been done in machine learning and a lot of acquisition of data. And so all this data, some of it in the public domain, some of it in private domain, is out there. And we're now going to see, I think, in the next 5, 10 years, remarkable sort of evolution in this space. What are we doing here? We're doing a lot of work in the voice space or verbal computing interfaces. So that relates to Alexa, Google Home, natural language processing, learning how we speak to computers. But I think that what we're really seeing is sort of this underlying sort of tip up that J-curve, that we're going to see just remarkable services, content, media, algorithmically generated, and over the next 5, 10 years, things are going to are starting to get really interesting and complex.
Is there one example at Betaworks that you'd point to, something you're working on now?
I mean, we did a lot of work over the last 2 years in the bot space, text bots. So let me talk about an example from there. So there's a startup there that we've backed that is called Hugging Face that is doing...
Hugging Face.
Hugging Face.
Okay.
It is an app that is designed for kids, for teens who want to have an experience with a pet AI. And so the founder, sort of his thesis is that just like we have pets, we will have pet AIs, sort of Tamagotchi-like things that we chat with as companions. And so they are trying to create that. And so they pushed that out into the App Store a couple of weeks ago. It's doing very well. A lot of kids doing a lot of really strange things. They know they're talking to a machine. They know they're talking to a machine. Right? I mean, it sounds so foreign. You know, in China, there was a bot called Chow Ice that has 40 million monthly active users, and people are chatting with it every day. So this is sort of, we've seen this in other geographies, but it's starting to come here. And I think this idea of where people know that they're talking to a machine, but they're having a social companion-like experience with a machine, I think is just like the Tamagotchi is fascinating.
So somewhere between gang violence in Chicago and Hugging Face is Hillary Mason. Hillary, what are you working on right now?
Yes, so we have a bunch of things in this domain that I'm pretty excited about, but I'll share just a few specific examples, and I'll also, we tend to work with folks in enterprise, so, it's not intuitive, but the enterprise perspective is really valuable here because you have a business you've been operating for a long time and deep domain knowledge about it. You have data that has been generated generally as the exhaust of some existing business process, and obviously a need to innovate, and today a lot of fear and energy around the need to use data and machine learning more effectively. And so in our work with enterprise, we tend to find that folks they would never jump into something like Hugging Face. This is something that has never existed before in the world, and it may be spectacular, or it might just seem a little weird. What they want to do instead is identify a process where they are currently paying people to do work that can be supported via automation. And then build tools to support those people in that work. And the distinction here is not to replace people, but to say, we're going to use these machine learning tools to support them. So specific examples of that are areas where, we have one client that is in a bank using natural language generation to automate large parts of their compliance documentation, which is then going to the federal government. I talked about this once at an off-the-record event, and someone from FINRA came up to me afterwards and said, we're now using NLP to parse these documents, right? Meaning that we now have regulatory language that is being written by machines, parsed by machines, mandated by the government. No human is reading it or writing it. And this is the world we're living in. Specifically on the media side, what we're seeing is more that people are no longer relying on the media to curate the information they access. So they'd rather take in many streams of data and then build their own tooling around how they structure and curate and understand what is relevant to them given their specific application, which is a change over the last year. Also, we've seen a lot of interesting generation work in areas that you would not typically think are structured data. So things like celebrity gossip reporting, it turns out actually is quite structured and can be generated in a useful way.
So I'll come over to Amanda, and can you tell us what you're working on here at Bloomberg as a way to set the stage?
So Bloomberg does a lot to surface content to our users very quickly in ways that will help them take financial action, so there's money on the line. One of the things that we do is we have a set of functions that will show you financial sentiment, bullish or bearish, for particular entities that are being mentioned in the news and in social media. And that's a fantastic function, but it only works as well as the very basic extraction of the entities and linking of the entities from the input text, news articles and tweets and so on. So we're working on improving both the coverage and the precision of the entity recognition linking software that we have at Bloomberg so that we can avoid situations like the one that happened last week, not at Bloomberg, where a lot of automated traders picked up that O'Reilly was being mentioned in the news because Bill O'Reilly was leaving Fox. And there's an automotive parts company called O'Reilly Automotive whose stock climbed a lot that day because the linking systems linked Bill O'Reilly to O'Reilly Automotive. We can't provide that level of service to our customers. We provide a better level of service. But what interests me, moving beyond that very basic functionality, is how do we identify when a new entity happens? Because that's an element of surprisal that can give our clients the alpha that they need to make money. Another thing that I'm doing that I just want to advertise to everybody, we're organizing a workshop, not Bloomberg, myself and some colleagues, at KDD, the Knowledge, Data and Discovery Conference, in August in Halifax, called Data Science Plus Journalism. And we really hope that a lot of data scientists come. We really hope that a lot of journalists come because what we want to do is talk about this intersection between the data and the journalism, just like we are here today.
Mm-hmm. So I want to go ahead and just get one topic kind of off the table just to start, because you heard it a little bit in John's comments. He actually referred to these technologies as the train that are coming at us, right? And you sort of get this sense of a metaphor that something's happening and it may not necessarily be good. Automation's coming at us quickly. How do we address this question at the outset of this event? I know it's going to come up throughout the day. Are these technologies ultimately going to create jobs, or are they going to kill them? What do you think? Hillary?
Yes.
Yes. Good answer.
I think it's very clear that these technical capabilities will transform what we mean by media. And when you think about what the vision of that is, it is really machines that interface with us using the same interfaces we use with each other. And because machines have capabilities that we don't have, you then have abilities to personalize, to generate, to filter content that are both incredibly powerful tools to augment our capabilities as people, to eliminate sort of cognitive drudgery in a lot of the work we do, but also kind of terrifying capabilities. So when we think about it as will it create jobs, eliminate jobs, I'm thinking much more around what will media even look like when we have full penetration of these technologies, and how quickly can we adapt to them? Because there is a tide of technical progress that is continuing, this is an area where we're seeing rapid change in what is possible. And that rate of change will continue for some time. I don't know how long. I assume in 20 years, we're not going to be having the same conversation. So perhaps it will have plateaued by then. But we don't know how long that will continue for, how quickly people and our human systems built on top of the technical systems will adapt, and then what it's going to look like when we come out the other side. So yes, more jobs, fewer jobs. I'm not.
Would someone else like to comment on that? Kathy.
So I would agree, more jobs, fewer jobs. I think it's going to change the kind of jobs that we have, and in certain places it will take jobs away. I guess I would go to the field of law where, traditionally there's a lot of work by incoming lawyers in doing the kind of work that is now done by e-discovery. So and one problem is with that, and I guess I would also going back to journalism, is just the quantity of information that comes at people now that did not come before. So could be having to go through, quantities of emails, or in journalism, the large amount of social media that we're not used to looking at as conveying the news. So I think tools can help people adjust to that quantity of information, and it can change what they do, hopefully to something perhaps more interesting, like as our first speaker talked about, the why of news. But I also think that what is going to be necessary is a workforce where people have far more technical skills than they did in the past. So people are going to need to know not only how to use technology, but also how to create technology. And we can see this at Columbia with the huge increase in the number of students going through computer science. Our undergraduate major is now the third most popular major in the college and the top in the school, with 800 undergraduates. And in data science, again, we see huge numbers of applications for the master's program. And I think it is important that as young people come out, whether or not they major in it, that they at least have familiarity with the tools and learn sort of the basic level.
So, John, you talked about the architecture is in place now. We've amassed huge amounts of public and private data. A lot of companies, a lot of pieces of government, et cetera, put the machinery in place to do something with that. Is the next step really the people part? We've got to get the workforce sort of up to speed to take advantage of this before their jobs are automated away?
I mean, I think that's a component of it. So there's an education component of it. There's a job training component of it. The government has a role in this. I think that I think there's also there's an ethical component of this, which we need to start talking about. Sort of what are the boundaries of how we understand how machines interact with human experiences. I mean, Hillary sort of touched on sort of these. I'm a firm believer that John in his introduction talked about the what and the why, and I think that there is this sort of quaint tendency we have as human beings to believe that we sort of like say, well, the computer's got chess, but they won't get Go. Well, they got the what, but they won't get the why, right? I think that what's actually happening is it is far more granular, and I think that our sense as human beings that we have this ability to be able to do things that machines can't do is going to be challenged on the border, and we need to start thinking about that now, right? Because, I mean, even the headline of the panel, machines are coming, right? We just went through an election where we can't actually rerun the A/B test, but to say whether it was determinative, but we know that machines, bots, political bots, had a significant influence on how people thought about the respective candidates in this election. And that is sort of the most sort of fundamental thing that we have in our society is sort of, the electoral process. And the fact that the new system was was rewired through that process. So I think should say to us, this is actually, it's happening now. So we've got to start all the retraining and all the thinking and discussion about the ethics needs to start now.
Is it to some extent maybe a problem that we don't actually know the why? Is that part of it?
I think so. I think that I think that there's, I don't know, this is what I believe personally. I believe that on one hand is that I as a human being, if you actually track my behavior, that I'm far more predictable than I would like to believe. So I think that I as a human being have this quaint idea that I'm special and that my choices are actually choices when in fact they're just patterns in behavior. That said is that I do believe that there is a component of human creativity and human thinking which we are a long, long way away. Maybe we won't get to being able to replicate. And we need to understand what that is, right? And we need to have a sense of enhance that, right? I woke up this morning and I saw, the Robert Priesig, the author of Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, passed away last night. And that book has a sort of wonderful discussion of what he refers to as quality, which he really digs into as a philosophical concept. Some people are naughty. If you made your way through it, it's pretty awesome and interesting. But that sense of sort of quality of like human interaction and the physical quality of being, fixing something with our hands, in this case a motorcycle, which much of the discussion centers around, I think is something, therein lies something that I think is really part of our human experience, and we need to highlight that because I think a lot of the other stuff, like where I'm going to have dinner tonight, ain't so special. I think Amex can tell you that probably, or Visa, or PayPal, or Venmo. Well, whoever I use, yeah.
So certainly, I think the election kind of covers everything. To some extent, we're seeing a lot more sort of sense of the externalities of these technologies, the externalities of social media, filter bubbles, fake news, bots. Are these things necessarily making the world a better place? How is Bloomberg contending with some of these externalities in its research and thinking about how to commercialize these technologies?
Sure. Well, let me start by following on from what you said and thinking about like data science as a whole, and especially my particular area of it, which is machine learning and natural language processing. Scientists, computer scientists, data scientists especially want to work with journalism and with the media to develop solutions that are mutually beneficial. Often, computer scientists come with our own blindfolds on and our own blinkers, so we don't know some of the interesting problems. And every time I come to one of these events, I'm reminded of some of the ways in which computer science and data science can really help journalists and the media. So it has to be a collaboration. There are two ways in which I especially think that maybe we overpromise in terms of machines. The first is that machines don't know what they don't know. So they can't tell you something that they don't know. They can only reveal, if it surprises you, it's probably a bug in the machine. And that's an opportunity to either fix the data or write an interesting story. The other thing that machines, especially machine learning algorithms as they presently exist, don't know is how to explain what they have done. So a journalist can have a set of machines that tell them, for example, that a bunch of stories, which is the most novel story, what's the stance of the journalist. These are all things that people in natural language processing, computational linguistics, and machine learning are working on. What's novel, what's readable, what's the perspective of each party in the conversation or in the interaction. But then the machine can't say why it's made that judgment. It can't say what factors helped it make that judgment. So there's still a huge role for human expertise to play in working with the machines to really write quality stories and produce things that are fact-based, which matters a lot, again, when you have money on the line, as well as in elections, and things that are explainable and things that are justifiable.
So the underlying assumption, though, is that we're gonna be able to solve these problems, and that we should be optimistic generally about the role of the technology in kind of getting us to a better place in society, and that media and journalism will necessarily be part of that. Are you all optimistic that we'll figure out how to race with the machines rather than against them?
I'm hugely optimistic. At Bloomberg and at my previous job at Yahoo, I see the newsroom, and especially at Bloomberg, I see the newsroom really working with data science, some of the people who are here in this room to create very forward-looking, fast, and accurate journalism, both text and multimedia. And I just think it's incredibly exciting and really helps people who are consumers of media to make better decisions and really be better informed.
Kathy, you must be an optimist. I'm struck by the idea of being able to possibly intervene in gang violence based on Instagram posts. What's your long-term outlook?
I'm definitely very positive. I wouldn't be in this field, doing what I'm doing if I wasn't. I think there are all kinds of opportunities, and I like to think a lot about the social ones, and these are ones for which we don't often have the funding or put the money in to do in any place. So, the one with gang violence is one. I would think a lot about detecting hate speech online and, either filtering it or in some way helping for the person who would be the recipient of it. I really liked John's example about the pet AI, and I guess I wonder whether it's possible to do something like that for elderly people. I see a lot of elderly people now who are stuck at home. So I think there are huge numbers of possibilities, and that a lot of them really could have a strong social benefit.
Hillary?
I think it's a bit of a curse. I'm an optimist and also a pragmatist. And so I agree that the ultimate vision for where this gets us is very exciting, and it offers huge benefits. I do think it's going to be chaotic in the process of getting there, and that is not necessarily a bad thing. It is, in fact, a kind of chaos that requires more creativity, more risk-taking, more experimentation, which is very exciting. But it's still going to be a very interesting next few years.
John, what types of media companies will survive or come to be and thrive?
Can I do the optimism?
Absolutely. You're going to give us a more mixed answer, I bet.
I am by nature an optimist, but I'm fairly skeptical. I think that the last few years have given rise to quite a bit of skepticism. I think that the tendency in our industry, which is there is a a belief in the future and techno-utopianism that drives through a lot of our thinking. I think has caused us to actually not focus on or ignore a lot of the unintended consequences of what the technology is doing as it relates to ad tech, as it relates to, we talked about political bots, as it relates to news discovery, news information. So I think that I'm a little bit more skeptical now, definitely, than I was. What was the other question?
Well, I was going to ask you, and by the way, we're going to go to your questions in just a second, but what do you think in this environment? Hillary's kind of predicted this sort of chaotic period now, where we go to this transition.
I think we're at the cusp, since we're riding up that J curve, and I think we're somewhere near the elbow, but it's going to get really steep, and that transition is going to be really hard for society. Right, and so we talked about the transition of jobs and skills and labor and how that's going to look in a world where there's a lot more automation, and we're definitely going to this concept of the digital divide. We had this that term was first introduced as the unwired and wired, and I think that what we're actually seeing is a much more fundamental digital divide that exists. And it's both economic, it's driven by data, it's driven by devices, access, and I think that is you go back to the election, I think that's that undercurrent is a good piece of what put our current president in office.
Mm-hmm. On that note, I would like to take some questions from the audience, and Dick, you've got one here. I think we have some microphones that are going to come around the room. I'm not sure if the runners are ready. Here we come here. I'll take the first one here from this gentleman right here. I saw his hand first, and then we'll come to you, man. Dick Reisman.
Well, sort of pursuing John's point, the utopianism versus the pessimism, to me the biggest issue right now is filter bubbles and polarization. And there's sort of this naive view that getting contrary information out there changes that, but a lot of data on biased assimilation says actually it can make it worse. The one idea that I've heard that seems promising, I'm curious your reaction, whether you're seeing anybody doing it, is the idea of surprising validators, where if you can identify the people who you respect and generally agree with, and they disagree on some point, then you will listen and think about it. And it seems like that's a way to break the filter bubble. If you can examine social graphs, figure out where there's something contrary that will be given some credence, and surface that stuff. So I'm wondering if anyone's seen it, anyone sees reason to think it'll work.
So massive polarization, disagreement. Even Obama yesterday in his first speech said something about the problem of filter bubbles. Is this one solution? How do we break this problem?
I mean, I think I'll jump in with a non-data science solution, which is that solution is a big word, but I think that the massive amount of engagement we're seeing at a local level in town halls where people are actually talking is a reason for optimism. I agree with you that I mean, when we have a conversation, there's many different mechanisms in a conversation to sort of change somebody's opinion or to sort of pierce a filter bubble, so to speak. But getting people talking, because I think that the massive scale of these platforms that we've collectively created and participated in building, at some level they're called social, but they're not very social. And
they're not very public.
The superficiality of connections, I think is part of what we need to break through. And so I think that sort of turning that into human-to-human contact, or matching it with, I'm saying it as a component, so whether it's marches, whether it's town halls, whether it's just civic engagement, that to me is that's cause for optimism.
Anybody else? Kathy?
I like the idea, and I think people are more open to it now of, hearing from another side. I think after going through the election, there's sort of this realization that, I know a certain kind of people, and I don't even know what the other people are thinking about. And so on the technology side, detecting contradictory opinions to your own and being able to present them, so exactly what you talked about, is something we could work on. I think it's hard, detecting contradictions. So it's something that, automating it would be something we can work on, and I'm very interested in it, but I think it's hard. We could do something where we might want to summarize opposite points of view. So what is happening, like I guess I shouldn't say there's certain channels that I never wanted to watch before on the news, but I now might be interested in watching them just to see what they have to say. If I could get a short summary of, what's going on in, these various other channels that I don't normally listen to or read or whatever, I would find that useful. And that is something that we could do now.
Kathy's talking about the Nature Channel. Hillary.
I just I don't actually know. This sounds great. I don't have anything to add over whether I think it would work or not. What I do think is happening is that we have woken up to the fact that this is a problem. And this reminds me a little bit of about 3 years ago when we started our work on applied natural language generation. There was academic work in one pocket, there were a couple of companies in the market, but some of the most interesting work was being done by malware spammer people who were trying to game SEO. And so I spent a good amount of time going down these rabbit holes, learning how these things worked. I had a really good story about this virtual girlfriend app that got banned from the iOS store because they built a language model off of Tumblr conversation, but they were Korean, they didn't speak English, and so then these virtual boyfriends and virtual girlfriends started swearing at these little like teenagers who were trying to have their sort of it was horrible. But really, what I'm trying to say is that a lot of this work was happening outside of our community and outside of the mainstream sort of tech community. And now we have woken up to the fact that we have an opportunity and, in fact, a responsibility to address these problems using the best of what we have to offer. And so we in this room can think about if advertisers are manipulating us, if people with opposing or disingenuous political points of view are manipulating us, what does armor look like? Like, what do we build as a community to support, truth? And that is a question that I'm very excited to see a lot of energy going into right now.
Anybody else want to add anything?
I imagine, my ideal newsreader, and we've done some work on this at various places that I've worked, has a bunch of dials. Right now, when you look at a piece of content, you know who wrote it, and you know sort of the topic. But imagine a bunch of other dials, like how reliable is this reporter? How reliable is this news source? How novel is this article? What is the stance of this story with respect to the entities that are in it? And so on and so forth. Then it becomes, we can do all that with some level of fidelity and improving fidelity. But then it becomes partly a design question. How do we surface that to users in a way that doesn't further overwhelm them? And how do we digest that so that, for example, you decide to read this story, but we also present you like with a graph showing that the sort of general trend of stance on this particular story at this time is different from the article that you've chosen to read. How do we do that so that our users don't just become incredibly confused and turn off altogether?
I'll take another question up here at the front. Mike's coming, right there.
Hello, I just wanted to thank you all. Wonderful to hear from you. You had mentioned ethics, and I wanted to know, where do we start? How do we address ethics? I think it's becoming more and more of a question, and we don't really have the answers. So I just wanted to hear from each of you, just where's the starting point for us?
In a lot of other industries, when externalities begin to become apparent, we create standards and regulatory bodies and all sorts of other things to deal with ethical issues. What do we do in media?
In natural language processing, this conversation is in some ways just starting. Just this year, I think it's the first workshop on ethics in computational linguistics, partly motivated by the fact that when you process large amounts of text the way we do now, what comes out is the biases of the data that went in. So if people in general are biased in a particular way, then what comes out of your model is that bias. And how can we overcome that or model that so that we can be more truthful in the ways that our computational models operate. At Bloomberg, of course, we have a very strong journalistic ethic, motivated, again, I think, by the fact that dollars and cents tend to focus people's attention. So we have a very strong journalistic ethic, but we have to be prepared as a journalism organization that there will be other journalism organizations out there, including ones in the financial space, that have a very different ethic. And how can we handle that kind of journalism appearing alongside ours?
Kathy, you spend a lot of time thinking about ethics at Columbia.
Well, I think one of the things that can help is just the surfacing of examples of what can go wrong. So I think people need to be aware of how data can be used in ways that you didn't expect it could be used. So bias, I think someone who has a really nice book on this is Kathy O'Neill, where you look at things like people who use data for hiring, and then, if you use all your past data on what were the good attributes of people to hire. For example, in the tech industry, you're unlikely to hire women because they weren't in your data set to begin with. I think sometimes it surprises people, like some of the very first information that was revealed about how much we can infer just from the location on your phone, and whether that is ethical or not, and who knows about it. when it first came out, we thought at Columbia, do our students know about this? They certainly should know about it. They should know what they're revealing in terms of their privacy when they opt into things. So I think some of it is making people aware of how data can be used in unexpected ways.
So it begins to look like many other industries where we've, rushed ahead, commercialized it, and then worried about the outcomes afterwards, whether it's cigarettes or chemicals or automated news media. Is that fair enough, John?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that I see ethics as sort of a meta layer of data that gives us a broader structure to be able to make decisions as a society. And I think that this, coming to terms with the fact that I think that the machine person sort of hybrid model is something we need to think about like now as happening. I mean, I think that 20%, maybe 50% of people right now have their brains fully submersed in their devices, so they're not actually here, right? And so I'm not making a judgment about that. That is the way we are living now, and so I think that sort of person-machine model is actual model that we're already like partially, fully engaged in the network a lot of the time. And I think understanding that and starting with that assumption is important. I think having asking the question of do we need to define, what's a machine versus a human being, and what does that line look like, I think is an important ethical question I'd love to see people smarter than me dig into. And then lastly, just picking up from Kathy's point, I think that inherently I think she's referring to machines of mass destruction or math destruction, right? And in that, I think that the point there, which I think is so important that we have to, as a culture and as a society, think about, is that algorithms are inherently they have design bias to them, and that can get spread at massive scale now. And so we've seen that as it relates to fake news. We've seen that as it relates to law and police departments locally using data for decision making. And as you think about what Hillary said earlier about taking a body of compliance data and it being created and then read by machines, there's understanding when that is happening, labeling that, transparency around that, understanding the biases of the algorithms to the extent that we can do that in a world where algorithms have tremendous commercial value, I think those are the interesting questions I think about.
Can I add one very quick point, because I know we're over time? Everyone in this room has a product, you're in the media, whatever it is. Ethics should be a first-class design consideration of how you use data. And we have had a chapter on ethics in every Fast Forward Labs report in order to promote having that conversation. I don't know what the answer is, but the question needs to be there.
I'm going to take one last question, very rapid one, and then a very rapid response from our panel before we call it a day.
Just a quick question to all of you, but perhaps especially Kathy. I'm a retired network television correspondent at ABC News, and I taught at Columbia for about 8 years. And I think you even might have come to one of my classes, but I'm not sure. Anyway, I'm worried about the network evening news, the broadcast ones. There are 22 million people who watch one of those three newscasts every night, not the cables, but the broadcast. What kind of danger is network television news in from data, and what are some of the possibilities of advancement?
How can we use data science to automate, or how will it be used to automate certainly video and news that we see on television? We're going to have talks about that this morning, actually. But anybody got something to say?
Well, there are all different forms of the ways that people receive the news. So in some cases, written, like a Facebook feed. I'm sure I am way behind on what other kinds of feeds young people are using right now. And I think different people have preferences for different kinds of presentations. And so, I do not see yet a automated broadcast news, speaking person, or truly all automatically generated with. So I do not see that coming yet, and I do see there being an audience.
How many years until we have that?
How many years? 10.
Okay. But it's within the realm of imagination.
It's within
completely synthetic, automated broadcast news.
It's within the realm of imagination.
Yes, max headroom. Yeah.
Yeah.
If I may, I would
yes,
have said
please.
2 years ago someone asked me about the understanding video, news video, to be able to recommend it and store it the same way we do text. I said 3 years. 6 months later, okay. So talk about a J curve. We can now summarize well-structured video like sports events in ways that we couldn't 2 years ago automatically. So I think it is coming. It's hugely exciting because it's such a big package video compared to text. And there is a lot of very interesting work to be done.
There are multiple people in this room working on this technology right now. So I can, just looking at your faces, I know who you are. But we're going to have to stop there and move on to our next panel. It's been a little doom and gloom, but I think, 3 optimists, 1 paranoid skeptic optimist, right? So it's machines of loving grace versus weapons of math destruction. I think that's, if we had to retitle the session, we'd call it that. But we're going to move on now to our next session. I want to thank this panel very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.